So when you're first starting a knife, the most important phase is probably the design and planning phase. And the design phase is really putting pencil to paper and drawing out what it is you want to attempt. And in that, you can sort of work out any problematic areas, maybe modify design configurations so that it's a little more pleasing to the eye. Roughing something out by eye is definitely something you can do, but when you're doing a new form or you're doing something a little bit outside of your regular comfort zone, it's really good to put pencil to paper because that helps you work things out, but also gives you a reference guide as you're working along. You can go back to that template and see whether or not your proportions are hitting it. The other major component to the planning and design phase is material selection. And when it comes to the blade, that obviously has to do with the steel, and there's really a lot of options in that area. And I'll go through a few of them here. This right here is Japanese sword steel. It's really expensive and hard to get, and requires a pretty significant amount of skill to work with it. It's not easy to work with, and there's another dimension of work that goes along with it that increases the amount of time it takes to produce something with it. But you know, skill is a good thing. So if you're able to refine your ability based on the material requiring you to have a certain level of skill to produce the piece you want, that's really a good route to pursue. But for the most part, myself included, modern makers really rely on modern steels, and also those are known as known steels. So you have stuff which is really specific, like Japanese cutlery steel is really good. This is white paper steel or shirogame, typically used for culinary work. The reason it's so good is because one, it's designed for that specific use, but also you have the specs that go along with it. So you know the process required, what temperatures to work at, what the heat treatment process needs to be to get the most out of the steel. But there are a variety of these steels. This is W2, and W2 is often a tooling steel, but also good for blades. Drilling rods are often made with W2 or W1. It's a water quenching steel, although most people will tend to quench it in oil just to reduce the risk of failure. And there's just a plethora of steels, carbon-based steels that you can select from. And making a blade out of a mono steel or one type of steel is fine, it's great. But at a certain point, you're going to want to push yourself toward the alchemy portion of bladesmithing, which is taking 2, 3 or more known steels and then combining them into a billet, something along these lines, and then twisting and manipulating and cutting and restacking to make specific patterns. And often you'll hear knife makers reference that as Damascus. It's not necessarily historically accurate, but it's fine to apply. The real term is kind of pattern welded steel, where you're taking a bunch of different steels and you're welding them together to make a pattern. Over and above that, there's of course stainless steel, which I play a little bit with, and you can also make patterns out of that as well, although it's a slightly different process that's a little bit more involved and is actually a little bit harder to work. And then another option is to use repurposed steels. Now, it's not great to rely solely on recycled or repurposed steels because you can't typically know exactly what those steels are all the time. But in some instances, you can do a few tests. You can do a little research, figure out what they are. I happen to be in an area, my shop is in an area right now that has a pretty significant logging history, and there's a lot of these old saw blades around. And because they're older, they're going to be a mono steel. So a lot of these blades today, when they're made, they're bimetal. So the cutting edge is one kind of metal, and then the upper portion of the saw blade is typically another kind of steel, and that's for their cost savings in terms of manufacturers. But these older blades are typically the same mono steel, and you can sort of figure out what they are a little bit and do a couple tests to make sure that you can utilize it. I like using this stuff once in a while, more for historical purposes, specifically in this area. People really like when you use something that's a local material. They can relate to the finished product a little more. But you can take this and you can combine it with known steels as well, and create various patterns and such, and still keep that story alive in terms of the finished piece for whoever wants to purchase it. So those are some of the major factors to consider when you're doing the initial planning phase. You know, there's material selection in the handle and the fittings as well, in terms of non-ferrous materials like copper, brass, all that kind of stuff. But that is typically sort of tackled at a later stage once the blade itself and the steel has been processed and the blade itself has been forged, and you're then sort of moving on to the secondary stages. Thanks for watching a video. If you have any interest in seeing more, you can find me on social media. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube, I'm even on Twitter. If you have an interest in maybe getting a knife yourself, by all means go to the website, and stay tuned for more.
Wow!